Mi chiamo Gary Frank e oggi spiego un po' la processa per creare una pagina. Somebody once said that if William Shakespeare and Michelangelo had collaborated on a project, it would have been a comic because it marries a visual medium and the written word. It's quite a large process. It starts with a writer and editorial who decide on the kind of story we need to tell. It then goes to me, the penciler. I then break down the story into a page of panels. It then goes to an inker who then inks my pencil line. It then goes to a letterer who adds dialogue. It then goes to the colorist who finally adds the color. And then we end up with the completed comic page. The first thing I see as the penciler is the script, which comes from the writer. It's very similar to a movie script. It gives dialogue and it says what needs to happen in each panel. So, for example, the page I've just been working on here, we have a block of panels broken down. This is a page which takes place in a police precinct. There are the various figures, the various characters which will be involved in their dialogue and where it roughly needs to appear. From that point, I will break the page down into a rough layout and then gradually work up the artwork to a point where it's then ready to go to the inker. Originally the task of the inker was to make something which was printable, because when the technology we used was much more primitive, it was very, very difficult to do straight from pencils. Nowadays the role of the inker is to enhance the art. The inker is an artist in his own right, so he will then add his particular stamp to the page as well. After that, these various pieces of dialogue are added by the letterer to the artwork, and then finally another artist will work in color to give life to the page and to hopefully give an extra touch, a touch of atmosphere, and then we have the completed page. It varies. The amount of input that the penciler can put into the story varies with the writer and the methods that the writer uses. The old method used to be what was called the Marvel method, which involved a very, very loose breakdown of events. And then the penciler would dictate the amount of panels on a page, the amount of pages used to convey a particular section of action or period of time. Nowadays, we tend to work much more in a much more structured way. There was a period in which the art of storytelling was kind of subsumed by the desire of artists to do large, spectacular panels, and the way that eventually the industry responded was to pin everybody down with scripts, which are written by the writer in such a way that the story it comes first. Personally, this is my preference as well. Referencing is dependent entirely on the type of story that you're telling. The main referencing issue tends to be costumes. When you're dealing especially with comics which have many, many superhero costumes, it's impossible for one guy to remember all of the costumes. So there's a lot of digging around to get the costumes and the various continuity elements right. Beyond that, I use Google Image a lot for inspiration. If I say, if I need a fire truck, Google Image. If I need a particular type of building, Google Image. Google Image has made the process of creating a comic book so much easier. Before, you either had to search out in photo reference libraries or DVDs or wherever you could find the inspiration. And often, if you look at a lot of the older comics, people just simply invented things. Nowadays, it's much nicer to get, when you're trying to create a realistic environment, it's nice to have the option of just finding that fire truck and drawing that on the page. I don't like to get too fixed on one particular implement, otherwise one day when that pencil breaks, I then have to find another one, and if I can't find the exact same one, I like to kind of to play around with various things. Otherwise this becomes product placement, and I'm advertising a particular type of pencil. There are lots of rules which you need to learn early on, and when you've been doing it for as long as I have, you kind of much of it is instinctive. I tend to try to go with a very instinctive interpretation of the script, because generally that works best when you try to read the story back. There's a tendency, if you try to overcomplicate things or you try to do something a little more clever or interesting, that when the page is finally finished, the story doesn't flow as well. I've found in my experience that it's much better to kind of go with the first impression, the first instinct. Most of the discussion and the finding the direction for the pages take place before. So I will talk with the writer, in this case Jeff, maybe 2 or 3 issues in advance, and we will discuss scenes, how things can be, how things can work, how things can fit into the broader story. When the script comes, sometimes there will be a mechanical issue. There will be something which maybe to the writer makes sense and seems to be the simplest way of doing things as he writes it, but when I go to translate it into a visual, into the visual phase, there may be a hiccup, there may be something which maybe works a different way better, which maybe needs to be rejigged. And normally I would just drop the writer a note and say, I'd like to just change this, I'd like to add a panel, or take a panel away, or maybe swap a camera angle. And generally these changes are no problem, so I would change at that stage. But most of the direction, most of the broader beats within the story are discussed beforehand. And I've worked with the same inker for a long time. I think that with the inker, with the colorist, when you find people that you work well with, it's important to stick with them, because it's very difficult to find an inker with a line which will enhance what I'm trying to do, and not work contrary to it. The last thing you want is to be penciling in a defensive way, where you're trying to cater to an inker that you know might not necessarily be giving you what you want, without having everything 100% nailed down. My penciling style is a very, very, what we call a tight penciling style. I don't leave much to be guessed at by the inker. Everything that he needs should be there already. I occasionally speak to the inker, because when I see a page in inks, sometimes there will be an issue which didn't show up in a pencil stage, but once it's there, clear in hard black and white, I'll see maybe that something needs to be adjusted. So we'll speak at that stage, and then he can make fine adjustments at that stage. But generally, the key is find somebody that you like working with and stick with them. The same thing with the colour and phase, exactly the same thing. You find a colourist who interprets the style and the atmosphere that you're trying to create. And if you've got a guy that works well with this, then you stick with him. There's a tendency also, some colorists will do varying amounts of modelling on faces, meaning that they will add contours with the colour and stage. You need to find someone who colours in such a way which is sympathetic to your art style, and doesn't try to fight against it, doesn't try to bring an interpretation which is contrary the interpretation which I'm looking for. Yeah, occasionally, if a scene requires a particular atmosphere, I keep saying atmosphere, and it is generally atmosphere that we're talking about. Maybe there will be a very dramatic scene, and we at the climax of that scene, we may reach a poignant moment. And for a scene like that, maybe sunset is good. So you build to a point where the sun will just be setting at the end of that scene, and so the climax of the scene takes place with a rich sunset palette. So things like that will be indicated. Often they will be indicated in the script, but often they will be something which come about during the penciling stage or some later stage, and then we'll kind of we'll try to tie all of the elements together in a way which has a dramatic effect. The lettering phase, sometimes there's some involvement, but often at that point it will just be, because it's mainly the province of the writer and also the editor. So they will go through and they will take out obvious errors, like for instance a balloon with dialogue being attributed to the wrong character on a page. From my point of view, it takes more the form that maybe there will be in the original script a piece of dialogue which becomes redundant during the pencil phase, because something which can be illustrated through the artwork doesn't then need to be reiterated by dialogue. So maybe at that stage I'll make a note to say, I'll make a note to the writer that maybe we don't need this particular piece of dialogue, or maybe this piece of dialogue can be changed because the story has changed slightly as it's entered the visual phase. That tends to be my involvement with the lettering, but apart from that, generally these areas are areas which are the province of someone else. The goal for me is not to have a beautiful image on a piece of paper. I try to do that because that's obviously an important part of the attraction for a reader. But the primary goal for me is to tell the story with clarity. So it's all in the interpretation of what the writer wants. I'm trying to serve the writer's goals, which is to get the story across. You need, to an extent, to learn, for example, figure work, to learn to draw well, because when you draw badly, when you mess up a figure, when you don't draw something well, you take the reader out of the story. You remind the reader that he's reading a book, which is a failure. That's the point at which you fail, or at which I feel I fail in my task. From my point of view, I would define success in creating something which a reader can start at page 1, finish at the end, and by the time he gets to the end has completely forgotten that he's reading a comic, that he's looking at black and white lines with coloured pieces or dialogue or panels. The reader must forget all of this. The reader must be completely involved in the story. So from that point of view, I try to keep the storytelling simple. I try to keep it clear. I try to keep the pages well acted. If we think of it as a medium, as a visual medium, in the same way that film or television is a visual medium, you can destroy a film by having somebody in the film who can't act. So from my point of view, I need the characters on the page to be acting properly. If I have somebody whose face is saying something while the dialogue is saying something else, it just destroys by tiny degrees the involvement of the reader within the story. So for me, everything is about trying to create a flow, trying to make the reader forget that he's reading or she is reading a comic, and just become immersed in the story. So from that point of view, it's a craft, I guess, rather than an art. Grazie per l'attenzione. Ciao, Lucca Comics Games.